Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending this session. My name is Nicole Johnson. I work for Chef. I'm a leader of an awesome team of people. None of them are here to hear that, but they're awesome, and I tell them that all the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about automating security and compliance. So just want to get a feel for how many folks are security specific. Okay. How many people are responsible for security and compliance? Okay, everyone's hands should be up. If you touch a system or write a piece of code or write anything having to do with the system, you're responsible for security and compliance. So when we talk about DevOps, you saw my fake chart there, but I'm going to really talk about DevOps here. So I'm not going to read you this definition, but really what it comes down to is delivering high quality working software faster, right? So that's our goal. Sometimes we're on the far end of not so much. Sometimes we're on the end of succeeding. But what does it matter if you're not delivering that high quality working software securely and you're not delivering it safely, right? So we talk about DevSecOps, and that's inserting security into some of the practices of DevOps and really making it part of what you think about DevOps. So you want to be able to modernize your applications, modernize your infrastructure without introducing risk. I can guarantee you there's already way more risk in your environment and in your software, in your applications, in your code, than you probably even realize. So the first step is, really understanding the impact of that risk, right? So what happens if your company gets hacked? What happens if card information is breached? That's a financial impact. What about individually? What's the impact of understanding that risk? What do you have to do to understand that risk? How much time does it take? How many people does it take? How much effort does it take? The barriers to entry. So when we think about security, typically, the barriers to entry seem really, really high because you look at those security documents, those compliance documents, they are absolutely intimidating. And the other day, I was talking with a colleague. As a matter of fact, one of the amazing folks that I work with who wrote the tools that I'm going to be talking about, and we were talking about HIPAA compliance. So think about HIPAA. You've got pages and pages of hard requirements, but then you've got all these squishy requirements. How do you account for that stuff? The way that you account for that is considering it from the beginning. So from the inception of a piece of software, you have to be thinking, how do I make this piece of software secure? Whether it's organizational or it's regulatory compliance, and you think about that throughout the process. So what do we mean when we say compliance? People throw compliance around all the time, and sometimes when I'm talking to an operations person or a sysadmin, they're like, I don't really do regulatory compliance. That's fine, but you still have organizational compliance. You might have environment policies, right? So a certain environment has to look a certain way because it exists in a certain place within your organization, right? If your non-PCI environment touches your PCI environment in any way, everything is suddenly in scope. Funny how that works, right? Organizational security, that's super important because the standards that we set as an organization in securing our systems, securing our software, that's going to be super important in creating the basis for how you secure those systems on an ongoing basis, all the way from the development process all the way to production. And those processes that you use to do that, those are going to be what make you successful in keeping your systems compliant. So auditability is a huge challenge, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So test-driven development. So I'm gonna take a step back for a second. Anyone here do configuration management, infrastructure as code, all those cool DevOps tools? All right, awesome. So you all know what I'm talking about when I say test-driven development. When you think about test-driven development, part of that is saying, okay, here's my thing that I'm building, here's my thing that I'm changing, here's my thing that I'm remediating. It might be an application, it might be a system, it might be a combination of the both. That's cool. How many systems does that thing touch? Probably a lot. So that's why it's important to have standardization of processes, standardization of tool sets, and really be able to look at this process and say, okay, here's how we're gonna treat this. We're gonna treat this in the same way all the way from build all the way to production. So you're building the thing, and you build the platform, the infrastructure, the application, and then you incorporate the testing. Awesome. Continuous testing. How many people are doing continuous testing? Wow, that's awesome. So how many people are doing continuous testing, incorporating security and compliance? So that's a typical answer, and that's fine because we all have to start somewhere. So when you start incorporating compliance into the mix, here's where you have to start having that hard conversation of what are we not compliant in? So I've been in situations where someone said, okay, let's run the tests. And we run the tests, and they're like, oh crap, everybody has to get out. Because there's a lot at stake when we're talking about compliance and regulatory compliance, right? So incorporating compliance all the way through the process is extremely important because the way that you build it from the beginning should be the way that you put it into production. And of course, the process is going to change, as you get closer to production, and it's going to change based on some of the environments. But ultimately, that system that you're testing on, from dev, QA, UAT, pre-prod, those should all look the same as they do in prod. So what do we do about it? We incorporate compliance through the whole process. And test-driven development and compliance, it's pretty good. It's a start. It'll get you about maybe 70, 80% of the way there. And it's sort of like that story that you always hear about the developer that says, I tested it on my laptop, it should work fine, right? What I'm going to show you today is a way to start doing some of that stuff early on enough in the process so that you are 70 to 80% of the way there. Now, once you incorporate continuous delivery or continuous testing and compliance, that's when you really start seeing success in terms of having a good compliance posture, right? There's always going to be some things that you're not compliant in, and there's always going to be exceptions, right? When you do your security architecture reviews, those exceptions should be things that you can account for easily, that you can test for easily, and that you can understand the impact of. And that's why incorporating security and compliance teams into the process early on, along with development and operations, is extremely important. So shameless plug for my colleagues at Chef with some hug ops. But when we start to get security, development, and operations folks all in the room and start working on this stuff and really saying, how do we make this something that we can all agree upon, and how do we make this a process that works for all of us? And that's when we start really getting folks on board. So, anybody here heard of Inspect? Okay, a couple folks. So Inspect is compliance as code. I bet a lot of folks here write scripts, bash scripts, whatever, to test for compliance-related things, right? What version of SSH are we running? But using compliance as code is really important because it kind of takes you back to that whole concept of infrastructure as code, right? So making your infrastructure something that you can treat like a code base. And you should treat like a code base. You test it, you standardize it, you make it repeatable, you make it modular. And by doing that, now you have the ability to take that and apply it across a large number of systems and get an answer back. So that auditability piece, being able to get that answer back to the question that you're asking about your systems, that's what really makes this extremely powerful. So it's open source, so you can start using it today. And it includes a collection of resources, just like Chef, just like any other configuration management tool that will go on names because I don't work for them. Just kidding. Inspect is, it allows you to take a compliance or security requirement and say, how do I make this declarative? How do I write it in code? And how do I run those tests in an automated way? So you take those tests and you apply them to whatever systems, whatever principles. So you've got this open source DevSec hardening framework, and take a look at this because there's a whole lot of stuff in here that you can use immediately that can help you immediately. And you can understand what your systems look like. So Linux and Windows, SSH, SSL, Docker, Ansible, Puppet, Chef, of course, Linux. And these are just sort of your base requirements. So when you go check your systems and you say, okay, we need to go make sure that these systems are compliant, here's the checklist. I bet somebody writes a script or goes and checks it by hand, right? And typically that process is long and tedious. If you can take some of those requirements and say, all right, here's the thing that we're testing for. But when we get the output of that script or that command, we need to be able to do something with it. And you wouldn't hand an auditor the output from a command line like that, right? It has to be something that they can read. So by adding the ability to add metadata to this, this is what gives you that auditability capability. So you can see here, you've got your control, so the name of your control, and this is just from basic CIS benchmark. So you've got your control, your title, your description, your impact. And so the output of this is all something that you can report on. Windows. Any Windows folks out here? Okay. So testing for Windows stuff, you probably use something like SCCM, and you might have profiles in there already. That's great. You can actually export those profiles and use Inspect to convert them to Inspect code. It'll look a little bit different because we actually have a converter built in, but you can convert that code as well. So you can't quite see it here. I'll show you something that you can see a little bit better on the big screen here. But CIS Docker benchmarks. How many folks are using Docker in production? Okay. So that's super, super important, right? Because Docker is one of those things that, standards for how to secure it haven't quite been defined all that well. You know, there's some basic things that you can do and some guidelines, but I don't think it's all that standardized in terms of actually putting it into practice, right? So being able to start here and say, these are our base guidelines, and then being able to add to this, because if you look at this, this is something that, you know, anyone can read, and you can definitely easily write it. So how do you go about testing it? You can test it locally, you can test it remotely, you can test a target over WinRM, you can test a Docker target. You can actually run inspect in a container. There's actually an inspect container. If you just Google, I think Docker inspect, you'll find the inspect container pretty quickly. So when we make this auditable, I'm going to walk you guys through a quick example of this, right? When we make this auditable, what we're going to do is say, all right, what is it that I want to ask a question about? What's my SSHD config look like? So we go to the resource page and we say, what's an example? Anybody else got an example that they might want to test? Okay, all right, how about SSL? What SSL protocol are we using? So that's a resource here. How about a file, a config file resource? That's in here. So all these resources are available with references, so you can start writing this right away. It's not a language that you have to learn. This is something that your security team can also take and say, we want to help you define these standards, because part of this process is going to be collaborating with these folks on the security side, and you know, the CISO folks who are going to say, you know, here are our organizational high-level requirements, customize them as you need to, and leverage them and test for these things and report back, right? So being able to take the output of this, stick it into a log aggregator, and send a report to somebody, that's extremely powerful, because how many of you can do that today? About right. All right, so if I wanted to do this, this is what it would look like. So I say my protocol should equal 2. How easy is that? I'm also saying that my owner should be root and my mode should be 0644. Pretty easy, right? I do an inspect exec and I test my system. Extremely straightforward. Now, if you were to write a script, grep the output, what do you do with it? You have to write another script to export it somewhere. And how do you do that on 100 systems? How do you do that on 1,000 systems? Kind of a pain, right? You need lots of people to do that. Or better yet, say there's a 0-day vulnerability. How do you find out what systems have that vulnerability, right? So if you're running version SSL, if you're running SSL 3, how do you know that you're vulnerable to that, I think it was Poodle attack that was fairly recent? How do you know you're vulnerable? You could be sitting there for hours upon hours and instead execute these tests against a bunch of systems in one shot and find out how many systems have that vulnerability. So when your CIO calls you up and says, hey, I read about this thing in the CIO magazine on the plane, can you tell me if we've got this thing? And you can say, sure, I'll write an inspect test to do that. And you can do that, right? So it's not a major event. So another cool thing that we've got here is InspectShell. So I actually want to dive in here for a second and jump in here. So InspectShell is cool because it's pry-based, and you can actually interrogate your system on an ad hoc basis, right? So instead of actually having to write the script somewhere, you can actually just do it directly on the system if you want to, play with some resources, see how, see what makes the most sense to test something, right? So as you can see here, we've got our help. We've got a whole bunch of resources that you can utilize. So if I say SSH, okay, and I can dive into this and interrogate the system, if I can spell there. So see how I just did that? Instead of actually having to write the inspect test, you can interrogate the system. And there's a whole bunch of options here, right? So if I say SSH, it'll give me a whole bunch of operators that I can actually interrogate against, right? So you've got this flexible open source language that you can ask questions to your system about, right? So how do we actually put this into practice? That's the challenge. How do you make that part of your process? And because it's an independent language that doesn't require a proprietary tool set, while we would love for you all to use Chef to do everything, I know that's not the reality, right? So you ask the question, what's the thing that I need to fix, right? I build it and test it locally. So for you Chef folks, this is going to be pretty familiar. Yep. So I've got, actually, sorry about that. Let me get out of here. And I'm going to bring up an example here. So if you look at this, I've got some code, some configuration code. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Chef, what I'm going to do here is build and test this locally. So what I've done is I've created a system, I've written a couple basic tests, and I'm going to use Test Kitchen to test them, right? So Test Kitchen is a tool that you can use as a test harness, and you can use that against a platform locally, in the cloud. But what I'm going to do here is say, hey, looks like these tests are failing. So all I did here was run kitchen verify based on this configuration and based on these tests. So as you can see, I'm just saying my port in my SSHD config should be 22, and my protocol should be 2. Looks like I'm failing. So what is it that I need to fix? So I'm going to build and test this locally, and this is a super basic example, for the sake of time more than anything. But what I'm going to do here is just go ahead and change these, right? So I know that my protocol should not be 1 and 2, and my X11 forwarding should say no. And so I'm going to go ahead and test my change locally. So as I'm doing this, think about how you make changes right now. Anybody, how are folks making changes today? Docker, I assume, testing some of your changes, some basic integration tests. That's pretty good. What if you can incorporate these compliance tests into every piece of code that you develop, right? So, obviously, verifying every single little thing isn't necessary, but being able to look at a thing that you're building and verify that it's going to be compliant, and also, sometimes when you build something, it makes a change on a system that you don't mean for it to, and you get to the end, and compliance is like, that's not compliant. You need to change this, and then you have to go back, right? So what if you can incorporate this early on in the process, right? So that's what I just did here. So to finish this out, oh, darn it, sorry about that. That was not supposed to go to the end. All right, we'll switch it there. All right. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Test Kitchen, take a look at it. It's your verifier. It's your way to build and test locally. For those systems that you want to do some integration tests on, unit tests, without having to go without having to go build a new one every single time. I love it when I walk into a customer and they say, yeah, we don't really test because it's such a pain. And then we show them Test Kitchen, and it's like, yes, we can build stuff quickly and easily. We don't have to go copy the template and install all the stuff and do all the things and run all the scripts in order to just test something basic. So check it out if you haven't already. And so being able to test locally, this gives you a quick feedback loop, right? So you break something or something isn't right, you can go back quickly and change it and iterate upon it, right? So this brings us to continuous compliance, right? So you've gone through this process of now incorporating compliance testing throughout your pipeline. How do you make sure that it's continuous? You really have to make sure that you're continuing to test in production. So again, your development systems should look just about the same as your production systems. You can do that if you're using config management, infrastructure as code, and you should be running the same tests. If not every test being the same, most of them should be the same. And when there's something broken here in production and you see that it's not compliant, you say, okay, now I know the change that needs to be made, and I'm going to go ahead and remediate it using that same process, right? So now you have a full circle, a full loop of that test, feedback, remediate, compliant, right? So this is how you get to continuous compliance, and this is how this is how you can incorporate this stuff very quickly in the process. So write a couple tests, ask a question to your systems: are you compliant in this regard, right? Is your SSHD config correct? Are you running the right version of SSL? Do you have this vulnerability? And just start small and start writing some tests, understand your compliance posture, and then you can figure out what it is that you need to do in order to remediate a large number of systems. So that's all I have. Thank you. Any questions? Thanks.
Okay, excellent.
I see a couple
I
there.
think we do have a hand back there. We'll take a few questions. Where are the hands? I see a hand waving.
So, inspect, you said anything or almost anything could be a resource, right? What if your infrastructure was essentially AWS and a lot of the products that they provide, the configuration that you essentially set within AWS, can that still be something that you test through inspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are actually some resources available for AWS. I don't know that all of them are open source just yet. I haven't had a chance to check it out just yet, but I just heard about it the other day called AWS Spec, and it's very similar to Inspect, and I do believe that it's something that may become incorporated into Inspect. So the answer is yes. So like there's some VMware resources out there. Let's see. I'm not sure if there's Azure out there yet, but there's a bunch of platform stuff as well.
Thank you. We use Chef, and then we have audit mode enabled, and
Yes.
we include our audit recipes after the execution recipe is run.
Yep.
Where would you put that into this process? Is this before deployment? Is this at runtime in addition to audit mode? Is this as a one-off against nodes that may have their Chef client running every half hour? Where do you go with this?
Great question. So I'll add a little bit of context before I answer that. So audit mode, that's sort of the, not to put you on the spot at all, that's the little bit older way of doing it. So we've changed the way you do it just a little bit. So you can incorporate your inspect tests into your Chef client run by using the audit cookbook, which is similar in concept to audit mode, but basically what it is a helper that says, go grab these compliance profiles from wherever I'm storing them. It could be our GitHub Enterprise instance. It could be the Chef compliance server. Go grab those compliance profiles, run them on the system, and report back into Chef Automate. So that's like the whole enterprise Chef setup, but you can do something similar with sort of an open source setup. It would just be a little bit more custom.
Okay. This was very, very cool, very fantastic. And for those of you who want to have a further conversation with Nicole, she will also be, I was just checking the time, she will be on the Arrested DevOps Live podcast tomorrow in the same time slot, the second one after lunch.
Yes.
So it should be exciting. We'll do that upstairs tomorrow. All right. Thank you, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.